Really thankful that you've come to share this presentation with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, Liz and Matt. I'm sure it's been a super interesting semester for everyone teaching in the spring semester of this year, because everybody probably had to shift lots of gears. I happened to do the same thing, and I got back to teaching, part-time teaching, by just one single class at MIT this semester. It just happened to be that way. But you know, like it was again, maybe I've been, you know, teaching in the past, so it was again like remembering a couple of things, replanning a couple of things, and with the sudden shift, maybe adapting to the situation. And then I ended up writing a piece about my experience, and I think that's how, you know, pretty much Liz discovered about this experience of mine and got in touch. So today here I'm presenting. It's a long title, but hopefully it's going to be clear as I move forward. So let me give you a background about what this class is, who I am, and so on and so forth. So this is a class that I taught at at MIT as a part of the design and computation group, and it's called I entitled the class as superseding parts, computing wholes. And the idea is, you know, it's about computational design, how we use computing for design, but at the same time how we have to change and shift our thinking about parts and wholes to create, let's say, meaningful designs using computing. So it's a pretty broad class in that sense, right? So you have like computational, generative, and performative design is the technical side of the class, but at the same time you have, you know, I love discussing about like aesthetics, ambiguity, beauty, and shape grammars is the other component. And usually you would discover that these two things, you know, wouldn't play maybe in a great way because there are kind of like contradicting, let's say, theories behind them. But I've been right at the intersection all the time. So that's what I do for work. That's what I've been doing in my research in the past, in my PhD as well. And I love teaching about that. So there's a clash of computing and meaning, you know, in that respect. So I started preparing the class earlier in the fall semester, so I was already looking into some ideas around November, and then I made a couple of posters. I announced the class in December, January, and I started, you know, taking some applications for the class, because elective classes, you usually get a lot of students who wants to get into the class. So I got a chance to advertise and, you know, filter out or pick some students for the class. And then the first class, I prepared this presentation that I'm going to share with you too, which is pretty much showing almost the syllabus, right? And it's trying to make it accessible for the students so they know what they will be dealing with for the rest of the semester. And, you know, also with maybe leaving some doors open, which I kind of did without knowing the pandemic would, you know, hit, but it worked in a nice way. So when we talk about parts, you know, we can ask Google directly. When you Google parts, you know, the word parts, you generally see these either biological parts or like mechanical parts, but the latter would be heavier, right? So you would see like car parts, the stuff that you can assemble to make pieces, you know, the stuff that you put together to make, let's say, greater wholes. But essentially what parts are descriptions, right? So we can look into something and maybe we are unable to explain it in its like whole, you know, structure. So we look into its parts, and we this way we can explain what it's doing. Also, these descriptions or parts can be described in, you know, depending on the context. We can explain the same thing in very different ways. For instance, I'm here taking pistons, right, or an engine, and you can describe this part in very different ways. So one is maybe the working principle, right, of the combustion engine. So we can speak about a piston and how it really works. Or this would become something else in a, you know, patent drawing. The piston would become a piece which has a specific number, and it just kind of like stands there and depicting, you know, the part itself there. And again, you know, this thing can shift its shape or description into other things. Let's say in this, you know, airbrush painting, it's a more artistic illustration, I would say, and maybe it can become almost this like self-standing object entity, which is becoming this sculptural piece. So eventually these descriptions and parts are about, you know, they change their, you know, shape, and our understanding change depending on its function or their presence, how they look, right? So we can always attend to how something functions on how something looks, right? And suddenly the artists are like so powerful in taking these parts and making, you know, creating other descriptions from that. For instance, this is a assembly, you know, a painting by Judd Turner in which he's merging pistons with other pieces of, let's say, or parts of an engine plus bones and so on and so forth, right? So our understanding of these parts are totally changing. So this is bringing the notion of, let's say, that the whole is very different, but at the same time, the quality of the thing that we are creating. You know, everything we look into, they have a specific quality about them that we can understand, you know, and work on. So this relates to design a lot, and I will kind of bring this back to teaching too. So I designed the class with these, you know, these, let's say, tracks in mind. Presence, which is like how something looks; function, how something functions, performs; quality, you know, the inherent qualities of something. And the whole is pretty much a system that generates all of this, or an understanding of a design, pretty much, right? So it's very hard to describe the whole, so it's an open discussion. And so I'm an architect by, you know, background. I was trained as an architect. I taught in architecture schools, and then at the same time, you know, I taught, you know, as I was teaching. So I kind of like kept jumping back and forth practice in academia. And following my, you know, let's say the PhD degree, I joined New Balance as a computational designer there. And it brought me, you know, this, let's say, opportunity to look into what I learned until that moment in a very different perspective of, from like huge scale, you know, building design, or let's say system design, to, you know, designing sneakers, and this time designing, let's say, systems for performative, let's say, products. And again, the same thing applies, right? So the parts, what is issue? We can describe it in very different ways, and the way we describe things and we will look into parts will change them. Again, this is, you know, this just laying the groundwork for the students and for the audience here too. Once we change the description of the parts, the whole changes too. So these are two shoes we released last year. I happen to work on the one on the right side, the one with the 4-foot 3D printed part. So they both feature these 3D printed parts, one on the 4-foot and one in the heel. And again, like, these are proposing a different understanding of, let's say, a different way of looking into, you know, parts and wholes. But the tracks that I was mentioning, right? So we have lattices that perform, which are, let's say, replacing the foam, but doing something better than foam, ideally. But at the same time, these things they have to look good, right? So that's the presence of, or the aesthetics of the shoe. And when combined, you know, this is, once you start changing the parts, I think what happens is that you get a chance to look into things in a different way. So I happened to teach another workshop before this class at MIT, and I called it shoe as a field, right? So instead of something that we wear as a product with laces and the midsole and the upper, you know, the question was, what if a shoe is a field, you know, that embraces, it's a field around your feet and it functions in a certain way. So just looking into things this way, I think, especially with additive manufacturing picking up, you know, so fast, we will need to change those part descriptions. And, you know, this I think repeated in the history. It's, again, like, I don't think it's a new idea. You know, bladeless fan by Dyson is a great example for that, right? How can you make a fan without a blade? Or microblades that you don't see, right? Or this is, you know, the Theo Jansen and his, let's say, moving kinetic sculptures are another example without having like no power source other than wind, right? So you make a sculpture, but also moving, and it can stand without any, you know, support and so on and so forth. So just combining this, how parts are making wholes and wholes are generating experiences. I think all of these are really interesting examples. So if we go these tracks, again, like going back to the syllabus, right? So I want to teach about visual qualities, aesthetics, but also empowering the students by giving some tools. One is copying. You can just look into things. You can, you know, cut them out, and you can put those parts together by using several rules and shapes, and that creates, you know, new compositions. So this is from decomposing to composition. So here is a sort of, you know, original artwork. If you want to be creative, you cannot find, you know, ideas don't rain from the sky. We look at things, we discover parts, and we just make things out of them, right? It's somehow like a computational understanding, let's say, of creativity. It doesn't cover creativity, all of it, but you can talk about creativity in, let's say, mathematical terms if you want to. So that's the point. And this is exactly about, you know, visual calculation, emergence, and ambiguity. I can take this shape and I can generate this painting in a step, you know, by following several steps of, let's say, computing or calculation. These are all from my PhD dissertation, which is using these rule-based, you know, drawing watercolor system. So you can end up generating unexpected, you know, results. And of course, you know, that's a little maybe the artistic side of things, and making things work is a different story, right? When you walk into a job like I have now with paintings and so on, people get curious, but also they want to see some tangible results, because I think there's a certain way for you know, design firms or companies in architecture or product design to work, you know. So you have to realize things, you have to make sure that things work, and so on and so forth. So that I'm addressing with function in this case. And I just gave this example to students, saying that, okay, data doesn't come from anywhere. It's something that we, you know, generate to have an understanding. It's another way of describing things. So data points are parts to, in a way, right? So we can put numbers together. Here in this case is underfoot pressure values, and generate some, let's say, structure to work with, let's say, description that we have in hand. So what's also happening is that, just stepping back to the, you know, part-whole relationships with generative design, with additive manufacturing, what's changing is the way things really work. Function is also changing, right? So the function is not devoid of shape. So these things kind of have to work together. And here is an example that's showing what you see on this, the show on the left side, which is the NCAP, you know, heel technology, which has this subcomponents, is leaving its, you know, parts to a, let's say, 3D printed unibody whole, which has let's say, these different zones instead of different parts, which are behaving in a different way, right? So we have to, how do we alter or change our thinking in accordance to that? And function is an interesting word I discovered as I was, you know, looking into this studying. So it's a noun and it's a verb at the same time, right? So a noun is it's the activity or purpose of the you know, thing, the intended, let's say, function of the thing. And the verb version is the how it really works, if it functions or not, right? And I find this example really great, because it's definitely not intended to work in that way, right? Like mechanically, computationally, but at the same time, visually, it just works, right? So I really love this, because it's also showing the tension between function and presence, the function and aesthetics, right? So the visual computing is pretty interesting. The way perception works, we can still see the parts, although it's not working in the way it's intended. And we can kind of, like, you know, play with these ideas in, again, maybe with meshes in the digitally 3D world, but also 3D printed parts, right? Designed for additive manufacturing. Again, like I keep saying this, but it's gonna be big. It's already very big, but it's going to be much larger than what it is now. And what we can do is we can make this playful, right? So you can make shapes. You don't know, here's for instance the noun function. I don't know why I did this, but it's playful, and it's a way for me to learn the material. This is a new material that I was looking into, trying to understand. And it functions in a way because it's interesting that I can play with it, and it's a tool for exploration. So it's somehow working in that respect, not for a specific purpose or function noun, but it's for learning purposes. And again, so I'm showing you will see like week 1, week 2, week 3. So we approximately plan to have 15 weeks. So this was the, you know, again, like a syllabus before, you know, everything changed. So week 5, look into design for additive manufacturing more. Week 6, you know, learn how to make a design space, create variations of designs and so on. And then start understanding how you can look into understand optimize the qualities, or which qualities can you optimize, which qualities you cannot optimize, and so on and so forth. So during this course, even before that, I ended up talking about metamaterials, how, you know, making different shapes by using the same material creates different sorts of performance. By this time, we already had, you know, multiple designs in, you know, 2D and 3D. We kind of happened to print like very preliminary parts for students to have a feeling of the parts, which was my primary goal for the class, because this was a class on, you know, additive manufacturing, and the physical aspect, like the perceptive aspect of the class, you know, you cannot really let that go, but we had to, right? So I'm going to come to that in a second. And these are some examples from, you know, our practice at work, like at New Balance. So we make these parts, you know, we track them, we learn from them. So what I'm doing is all that learning in architecture, the design processes, computational design processes, but at the same time, how we implemented this design for additive manufacturing process at New Balance, just combining that know-how and, you know, bringing the syllabus together, putting the syllabus together. So essentially, you know, you make the parts, you create variations, and you have a design space. And essentially, this is a cycle, right? Although it's going track by track, you know, you have to design it, to evaluate and repeat, and so on and so forth. This is something very basic about design in my mind. So this is spring break. This never happened, and so I'll just quickly go you know, just skim through the rest of the syllabus and come back to the experience. Again, while talking about quality, you know, one thing I repeatedly said was, quality is hard to describe, you know, is easier to sense, perceive. You know, quantification is hard, quality side is easier to understand, but how do we design for quality is a big question. And then my goal was to use the rest of the semester after 10th week for the students to find a project, discover a project, and just work on it. And I would, you know, help each of them to develop whatever their idea is, instead of assigning one single thing to produce or one single thing to design. And also this, I constantly talked about not only designing the part, but also designing the way of designing part, right? So you design the method, not only the, let's say, the part itself. This screen is, I ended up in the same classroom. This is from that workshop that I mentioned, which I taught almost like a year ago before this class. But again, it gave me, it was I think, an opportunity for me to understand again why front loading the workshop or a class works really well, and why walking into classroom, each and every classroom with a lot of material that's already sold helps a lot, right? So this was a 3.5-day workshop, right, in which we handed some, let's say, scripts or tools or models. They were refined to maybe 70% already, right? So it's very different notion that you hand something. It's not teaching from zero ground up. It's rather you give something and you explain why it's working, what it's doing, and it's kind of all transparent. So if they want to go back to, you know, the history of that 70%, they can understand. But you give them this, and they, you know, you ask them to put on top of it or use it, you know, modify it to achieve whatever they are trying to. Okay, and then final review. We had a finals review, so that's good news. I'll get back to that. So this is a portion that's pretty interesting, right? So I talked about very technical sides of, let's say, design and manufacturing and design processes and so on. But I'm really, like, I also invest a lot in the, you know, theoretical side of things. And I'm really interested in pulling all these understandings from non-obvious, you know, fields. For instance, in design and architecture, you know, depending on people's interests, they can always go into philosophy, anthropology, and so on and so forth. And I kept going into those, right? So I brought lots of understanding and, let's say, knowledge to my dissertation too. But at the same time, it was my interpretation, my understanding of what's happening. So I just put these like 5-6 books together for students to say, hey, either you should go read it, or I'm going to give you, you know, like a portion of like a little excerpts from these books so you can look into them. And, you know, one is this one, The Black Swan by Nassim Taleb. It's about statistics, predictions, and it's pretty amazing, you know, like how improbable, events affect our life. And this was the first book that I showed in the syllabus, and it happened, right? So we had almost double, triple black swan events, including, the pandemic, but at the same time, the stock market, economy, a lot of stuff happening around the world. Some distress happening around the US, especially. So this was a really kind of like interesting resource in that respect. So the other thing is, speaking about quality, just going back to this book is pretty important, because Robert Pirsig talks about quality a lot, and he mentions it, is something that we cannot really exactly, explain in an easy way. But at the same time, he talks a lot about the scientific methods, which is pretty much about splitting, the world into pieces. He uses the term analytic knife, meaning that, okay, how do we split? Where do you put the knife, and how do you kind of, let's say, classify understandings or parts into subgroups? And whatever you do, you need to change it at some moment, and so on and so forth. David Bohm, amazing physicist, they released a new video about his life. It's pretty amazing on YouTube. It's called Infinite Potential. Please watch it, because he's an amazing physicist who is able to talk about being human by using subatomic particles. That's an amazing phenomenon for me. And he has an article called Meaning and Information. If you get a chance to read it, just please read that. I think it's very foundational and very strong to understand, science, being human, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, because I'm talking about computation, I suggested to go back to this book to understand the foundation of how, computers emerged, why the reason was, what artificial intelligence is, and so on and so forth, right? So today people talk about it, but at the same time, it's very useful to go back in time and look into and understand how these things emerged. The last thing is, this book, for this class, I showed, okay, this is very important because he's talking about the limitations of computing, which I'm super interested in too. As you see, it's a lot, right? So, I mean, I knew this wasn't going to happen. I didn't expect them to read the book. I suggested that you can look into one or multiple of these, and then I would expect you to, write 1 page or 2 pages about your project at the end of the semester. So, and then I put these notes. I said, okay, schedule is tentative, right? which happened to change a lot. Again, all coincidences. I don't know. This was an amazing semester. And then, number 2, number 3, they just take care of those. And the syllabus was very short, but I just wanted them to know what to expect.